not wrong, today I was asked to make some short presentation, very short, about the practical side of human rights, what can be done. And I have prepared something, of course, a little general, because we have to discuss. And some of these topics we already discussed in our group, but I have thought about something, what can be done, but don't expect too deep things. So I will start with this. So let's call the implementation maybe of the topic human rights. This is my topic. I have the first thing I tried to say or to present is that we should, in this group and in general, try to bring different actors together in this group. Also, we have spoken in former times about a possible maybe conference or things like this. So we should bring together a lot of actors to speak with them about a common so-called working plan. These actors can be scientists, but not only. Also local, regional, and central political actors should be maybe part of this bringing together, and also NGO activists. This is important, even, and this is of course something personal from my opinion, Yasemin knows this, even if I have also, for 10 years, I was working in a migration NGO in Turkey, then I left in 2015. So I can say I'm not an NGO man, but I worked in this field to do something. So we should also work together with these NGO activists in our group. We should maybe also focus a little bit maybe more on this point, even more than maybe on the other actors. The second thing is that we can agree, and this is the point which is important. For example, we have legal scientists like George here, social scientists from different fields. So we should try in this group, of course this is general, to achieve a certain form of consensus among our scientific areas. This is also, I think, this was also the plan from the beginning a little bit. Also in this book, we tried to bring, or we make a sort of symbiotic synthesis of all these points. And I think because we should be critical, whatever this means, let's say it like this in the beginning. And so the legal scientists especially should be asked a little bit to drift away a little bit from a dominating positivistic understanding of legality. This is also a problem, I think, in human rights, or at least ask and question this sort of positivism, because I think the formulation of legal regulations, norms, and concepts, etc., was very long presented abstractly from the material reality. And I think our group, especially, this is my standpoint, our group should bring these things together. So the law, I think, should be again brought to with 2 feet on the earth. When Marx tried to do this with the idealist Hegel philosophy, we should try to do this with law. This is my opinion. The other point is this debate in our group, the implementation should be the discussion about concepts and also practical sides like homeless people, migrants, all the other issues of human rights should be brought in, should be linked together into a framework of processuality. And I think we should always ask the question, and here it's maybe a little bit subjective in this moment, we should always try to debate also about history a little bit, because what happened in history, what happened in social processes, what happened in social fights. So the question what history is and should be, even if it is difficult, should be also aimed at being showed. The other point, and we mentioned this last time, George, remember when we have spoken of Peter's presentation of the elective period in Germany, we have spoken of this global side, this global dimension of human rights. And I think the step from theory to praxis nowadays in this world should include intensively the global dimension, as it was also shown by the pandemic. And George, you know, from South Africa, we have spoken about institutional and individual actors. We have spoken of unjust distribution, for example, the vaccination even the vaccination medicine is distributed unequal, or it is even not distributed. I have seen some statistics, for example, in Afghanistan, I have heard yesterday, no more than 4% of the whole population is vaccinated. And this is also a problem of production and distribution. And so I think the concept of morality, in quotes, should always be linked to the material world. And if we think about the fact that the world in the 21st century has all the material resources to create, maybe the first time in the history of mankind, maybe, I'm not an economist, but, or has all the resources to let people live in welfare. So on this basis, on the material things the world can give us theoretically, and from the resources, the debate about human rights should be also include the problem of morality. Now I will come to this question, because Peter has asked me justly that the problem of morality is maybe too theoretical and too subjective. I'm aware of this, but I think in this debate, with morality, I mean, or with moral universalism, I mean morality as in the framework of a process of social struggle, for example, gender equality, etc. These are results of social struggles. And when I speak of morality, I don't mean any philosophical abstract concept of this. I mean the result of social struggle. This is, for me, moral universalism for myself. So this is linked to the practical side. So this is a little bit an historical understanding of morality. And when we speak about this point, I have mentioned this before, it is necessary to focus always on preferences, because I said before, and I know that maybe some of you do not agree with this, but I think, as I mentioned before in this group, not everything can be approached distanced and objectively or even scientific. There are always topics, I think, in this debate who are emotionally loaded, like, for example, the topic fascism. One of my areas is also fascism. I teach theories of fascism also. So, like fascism, the human rights debate is so emotional at the same time. But I think exactly this subjective side maybe is a chance maybe to bring the people together. So in this framework, we should formulate goals who have to always be linked to historical processes, what we have reached, and that we cannot go one step behind. We should not fall one step behind. And I think in our group, we should also debate about taboos who are no longer taboos. For example, the property question. So I think the social responsibility of richness has to be redebated, and we know, and Peter knows this better than I, from Berlin. In Berlin, we had this referendum, which is not formal but informal referendum, that the part of the living spaces should be brought into the property of the society or the state. This was a sort of breaking with taboos, and this is now widely debated again, like in Berlin. Or the other example is in Austria, in Graz, in the city, which is normally relatively conservative, the KPÖ, the Communist Party of Austria, has won the elections, local elections in Graz, and probably the mayor of the city will be a member of the Communist Party of Austria, LKK, she's Austrian. So there are happening things which seems to be not so possible maybe years before. On the one side, we have still the ongoing debate on an abstract form of human rights. We have spoken in the beginning, remember, we have tons of human rights documents, and the world is miserable, more miserable than before, than ever. This is the ideological side also, and we have a lot of moralizing attitudes. What I mean with moralizing attitudes is this detachment from the social question. This is what I mean with morality. And so we should maybe go into these topics. We should maybe have all these things in mind when we debate, but I'm aware that I'm not saying anything new. What shall I say new? I know this, but these are maybe some things which could be done as a sort of the practical side of our debates. So this is my little, not very deep contribution to the topic. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Just before I say, before the long answer, just one correction. In Berlin, it was a formal.
It was formal, yes.
It was formal. It's part of the Berlin Constitution, and just a correction there. And it has to go now through the process.
Ned, but I have heard from politicians, Peter, that there is no duty for the politicians to implement the results of this referendum.
That's another thing. But
Okay.
the referendum was formal, and they only said the Senate has to decide now, and they have to go on.
Okay. But this referendum, this is what I meant with informal, has no decisive power to force the political actors to act according to the results. This is what I meant with informal.
Well, it is, and perhaps it is actually important as well, because the Constitution said, or the referendum had been on this topic, asking or forcing basically the Senate to elaborate now a law that is then implemented. But it was not we decide that this is happening, but it was we decide that the Senate has to discuss. So it's in linking, I say this now because this is linking to positivism anyway. It is all within this procedure, and there was no decision you have to expropriate.
Okay. I wanted to say, I said informal because it's different to Switzerland, where the referendums are directly decision-making processes, and the politics has to implement the decision of the referendum. This was, okay, this is what I meant with informal.
Yeah, put two Germans in a room and they end up talking about Berlin, yeah, are German-born.
Well, you can say anything. No. You can contribute something with a referenda in the island because you have the referendum there as well, more or less frequently.
True. Yeah. No. I don't have any comment. I'm just.
Okay. George has lifted his hand, I think.
Yeah. Thank you very much for that overview. Which I agree with, and I find it quite fascinating. I want to pick on one point that you made, about history. Dealing with a subject such as human rights, I think looking back is extremely important because times are changing, and what may have been, obviously, fundamental rights are, are rights, but in their application, how yes, their interpretation, application evolves, differs with time, and as society moves on, how they were conceived when they were introduced and how they are implemented evolves. And obviously, the context, I would like to add also the fact that the context plays an important role. I want to throw in an example which is not specifically, it is linked to human rights, but I wouldn't call that human rights as in the narrow context. Take some of these instruments that advance certain rights. Take the convention that deals with refugees, and asylum seekers. When it was introduced, when was it, 1951 or thereabout, was very relevant to the situation. But now it's still relevant, yes, but there are new challenges that these instruments need to deal with, and this is where the interpretation, the application becomes even more relevant for these instruments, and I dare say rights they provide to be even more relevant. So I would throw in the context there, and while looking at the history, seeing how the interpretation, the application, and sometimes even how the rights are respected has evolved. You could look at it nationally, you could look at it regionally, and you could also look at this from a global perspective. So thank you very much, colleague. Thanks, colleague.
Okay.
If I may link to the question of history, I'm wondering what is going on now in many European countries, EU-European countries, that on the one hand, after 45, we can say by and large, there was progress. No, sorry to come again with Germany. Kurt Bachmann, member of the Cape Communist Party Germany, said when they elaborated the basic law, he said, and we, the communists, will be one day those who defend what you are deciding. We are against this basic law now in terms of deciding, but we will be those who defend them. If we look at Poland, if we look at Hungary, if we look at, I don't know, Portugal overcame fascism, we have in many countries now not yet fascist movement. If you look at the AfD in Germany, if you look at the Polish reactionary forces, in Turkey what's going on there. So we have a turn again. What do we do with this? So the progress on the one hand, history is apparently not warning enough that it is there. And if you look at the Warsaw Ghetto, what was going on there, they are preparing basically the same strategy for nowadays. And this was a disaster. This was a catastrophe in terms of humanity, in terms of human rights, the Warsaw Ghetto. And no, they are working towards this. If you look at the AfD, the results of the elections, the votes they got, it's tremendous. It's frightening. I don't want to talk about Hungary, where you have this little emperor taking over basically fundamental or basic functions of the government. There's no democracy anymore. So how to deal with this is, can we do something in terms of history? Yes, looking back and show how it was, or is there more to this?
Can I say something again, a little bit theoretical? I think we should first, and this seems to be useless, we should first speak, I think, about the possibilities of the world, as I said, and we should try to locate our understanding of progressivity, for example, with this. I will give you one example. This is my history understanding. For example, if the world is ripe nowadays, for example, to employ equally women and men, the world is ripe. The world asks for this because we have this the need for developing and for adding everyone's creativity. And if a society, I'm only speaking of I could now speak of ours, but it's not important. For example, if a society, let's say Saudi Arabia, if a society is practically and voluntaristically and based on certain interests refusing the addition of the rights of the woman in this world in an action of political decisions, then it is my understanding, and this is the reason why I said historical context is important, then I would say, in this context, this is a reactionary country. And I would not accept to debate, for example, about anything in this context. This is also what I meant with though the history is, there are, as I said, there are possibilities to be fulfilled, and not because it's an utopia. It is a necessity for the world, huh? Like the global dimension for South Africa, right, George, it's a necessity to create a sort of equality of man, especially in the field where we had colonialism. And if this is not done, this is reactionary. Huh? This is my understanding. And this, on this basis, we can also try to locate the human rights debate, in my opinion, to this point. Huh? So we should look to these things. And the other point, again, coming back to the problem of preferences, as I said in the beginning, but this is again a little bit, again, maybe too theoretical, but nevertheless, we are debating everything in our group. The problem of preferences. I will give you one example of Turkey, of my country. This is important for us, and Yasmin, as a sort of living possibility. Turkey is still theoretically a laïcistic country, even if it is steadily demolished by Erdogan. It's still a laïcistic country. And laicism was both the result of social struggle, one side. On the other side, it was a preference. Sometimes you make political preferences, and sometimes you make these preferences despite the reactions from so-called below. Huh? This was the same thing in Afghanistan. In Afghanistan, when the people revolted against the Soviet Union, against the so-called Soviet intervention, these were most of the time people who also revolted against the equality between gender. So I think we should bring all these things together, and this is, I think, an interesting part again of this group, in my opinion, because these subjective sides and political sides in the human debate, they are not detachable from each other. They are linked together. You cannot isolate them. You can never make a strongly analytical debate on human rights. This is not possible. And this is the reason why I introduced something like morality, which is, of course, based on my political standpoint, abstract, I know, but I tried to link it to the historical context. I only want to say these things.
Can I come in there?
Yes.
Yeah, Joe here.
And George.
Thanks, Mehmet, for the earlier. I had to step out briefly, so you may have mentioned this, but you mentioned about the emotional aspect to human rights and in relation to taboos and so on. And I think that obviously you were referring to the possibilities and shape of the discussions in our group as well, or that has implications for what we discuss in the group. So I think, and in the context of, I think thinking in itself has a critical dimension, and thinking about society has a critical dimension, and thinking about ideology as itself, self-reflective. And in that spirit, just allow me a general remark. I think we should be aware in our own discussions of inhibitions and silences and omissions, perhaps, on our part. And sometimes we might, as a group, because we have a diverse international set of participants and scholars from different countries, and in those countries, whatever one thinks of human rights at a descriptive level, the human rights situation in those countries differs, and say distinguishing in particular civil and political rights from social and economic rights, we can say, as Mehmet and Peter were referring to, the some of those civil and political rights differ radically from in different countries, and we can say we can deplore negative developments in relation to civil and political rights, especially in some of those countries. So it's important that where scholars are located in particular countries where there may be influences on them, say professional influences or potential professional influences, which make them less likely to be critical of the existing political regime, we should be conscious of that dimension too to our in our discussions.
Yes, can I say something, Joe? But I think this is exactly at the same time, this is also a necessary emotional side of the debate, because we have spoken about this. Remember, we had these country findings. Countries have specific concepts and problems. For example, in Turkey, the problem of centralization. This is a main problem in Turkey. But at the same time, this is the subjective side, the emotional side of our debates at the same time, and this is something I think valuable, from the beginning. I only wanted to focus again on this topic. I wanted to make a little bit, because we are from different countries, it may be difficult to define a stringent and consequent and meaningful analytical approach sometimes, enclosing all of the peoples from different countries. This is my opinion. This is what I meant. It's difficult. And we should be aware of this problem. There is not one, maybe, mainstream analytical approach, maybe. This is how I see it. This is difficult in some topics like human rights.
But exactly because it is difficult, I think we need to, we have to try to find something. Two examples. So one, sometimes I don't know, I don't do it because I have too much time, but I stumbled upon a documentary. I think it had been from 2017, and Mr. Rossmann, German millionaire or whatever, said, but first I have to make money, in brackets my interpretation, first I have to exploit people to be able to distribute and do good. This is what Mr. Gates, Bill Gates, has now officially as job. He is philanthropist, which I think is the best joke I ever heard. You make millions for exploiting people, and then you say, but I spent this money for a good cause. If this is a good cause, that's another question then again. But how to define this? If I look at the question of gender, I think it is marking a problem we have to discuss as well. And in principle, I think we agree, but how to define it? Now we have a strong agenda actually from the entrepreneurs. McKinsey, you find, if you look at McKinsey material, you find every month at least a special issue on gender equality. Women have to be in the part of the ruling class, the CEOs, and. I can take it this way. Women have to be exploited and exploiting positions, then it's fine. What is with the rights of women? I said, with the topics, I said, the right to migration, but as well the right to stay. What is with women? The right to at least not to be forced into employment. And this is what we have actually in Ireland, what we found there, equal opportunities when Ireland joined. And of course, Ireland had to adapt to these rules there. And everything happened, equal pay end, even if it was not fully implemented, but everything else had been left as it was, meaning the division between gender, abortion, all this had not been touched. At least this was then, and then you come with your fight. This was then an additional fight by the women, by the feminist movements in Ireland. So yes, but what is if the others, meaning those we don't like? Now I'm talking about morals and what they when they say yes, but okay, you can work as well. You can get into employment and you have to be exploited. And we don't take care, and this is what is happening in many cases. We don't care how you manage, because it is still the woman, how you manage to get on with your children. You have to look for caring for the children, and you have to have the job. And we do not provide public services for childcare, for instance.
Can I just briefly, I'm conscious other people may want to contribute, but just Mehmet as through the chair, that's okay. I think what Peter is, to generalize or to abstract from what Peter is saying, the role of the policy analyst, let's say, or the social philosopher, is to look with the polite skepticism, or examine with polite skepticism the rhetoric and the ideologies such as human rights. But in this case, the example Peter gave us of capitalists promoting gender equality. So I would take from that, examine with a polite skepticism the rhetoric and discourse of actors, organizations, systems, institutions that purport to advance human progress or to advance gender equality. And that applies to Bill Gates, it applies to Herr Rossmann, it applies to Orban in Hungary, it applies to institutions and systems. It also applies, because both Peter and Mehmet mentioned it, it applies to erstwhile progressive political forces. And again, they should be treated with, they need to be treated with a polite skepticism. So the communist forces were mentioned a few times. And again, communist parties in Austria, the mayor of Austria, that could be a very good person in the sense of the progressive policies, I don't know, but they should be examined cum grano salis, as with a pinch of salt. And similarly for existing and previous regimes which purport to progress human emancipation under the banner of communism in the Soviet Union and the old East Germany, in contemporary communist regimes like China and Cuba. A polite skepticism is required in the same fashion as we have a polite or not so polite skepticism towards McKinsey and claims of gender equality. Thank you.
Maybe I could say something. I think there's a difference between, whenever we talk about progress and progressives, I think there's a difference in terms of ideology, in terms of civil and political rights, and the notion of gender rights, and the notion even of rights across ethnic minorities and ethnic difference rather than ethnic minorities. To go back to what somebody had said earlier about capitalism, you can be a black capitalist and a female capitalist and still be a capitalist. So I think that what has happened over the centuries is that capitalism and those engaged in capitalism realize that it's advantageous to have people of different colors, ethnicities, religions, and genders involved in the market. And that hasn't changed the market, though. It hasn't changed the exploitative nature of capitalism. And it's one thing that I noticed, for example, at my own university. The trend now, and it wasn't a trend a few years back, but now it's a trend that everybody is talking about gender equality. And not even just male, female in terms of gender equality, but the sort of the spectrum of gender identity, I suppose. People are talking about that. People are talking about, we need to ensure that refugees are involved in the university, and that people of colour are involved in the university. But we still rarely get anyone talking about why is it that we have two universities in Cork, one for the poor and one for the better off. CIT, which has now changed its name, is the university for people who come from poorer working class backgrounds. There's an over-concentration of people from those areas in that university. UCC is seen as the posh university where people who come from middle class backgrounds go to. Any suggestion that we would unite CIT with UCC would be spurned, has been spurned any time I've raised it. And I don't have much in the way of opportunities to raise these types of things because I'm quite low down the food chain. But I think that we need to think about that whenever we talk about progressives, that capitalism reinvents itself as circumstances change, as contexts change. So we talk about neoliberalism, but the neoliberalism that exists today is a different form of neoliberalism that exists during Margaret Thatcher's time. It's a friendlier form of neoliberalism, shall we say, a more comforting form of neoliberalism, because it involves these diverse groups that often felt excluded. Now they feel included. It's a wee bit like the whitening of the Irish, as somebody have written about in terms of America and in terms of Britain. At one stage, the Irish were seen as an outcast group in Britain and in America in terms of jobs and opportunities in the system, in the capitalist system. And now they're part and parcel of it. Now they're at the top of it in some ways, both in Britain and America. And I think that's the same with gender. And I think that's the same with ethnic difference, that capitalism needs to reinvent itself, needs to incorporate the diverse parts of the world into it in order to be successful. But it's still capitalism. It's still exploitative. It still leads to the majority of the world's population at the bottom of the pile, and the resources of the world being concentrated in the hands of a few. So maybe that's where I would come in terms of my analysis of things. That whilst I think it's great that women now have an opportunity to participate in capitalism, it doesn't change capitalism. It's a bit like saying Margaret Thatcher becoming Prime Minister of Britain was an advance for women, because now, for the first time, we've got a female Prime Minister. But to be perfectly honest, in my experience of the woman, if that was an advance for humanity, then God help us all, if there is a God.
But
I want to.
I say something?
Antonio. Okay, Antonio.
Sorry.
Okay.
No, I find the topic very interesting and relating to the goal of the group, as stated by Mehmet and also by Peter. I think what we are dealing here is with maybe with a tension between the specific aspects of human rights and the global aspects of human rights. And I sympathize with this analysis that Philip just gave about an analysis in terms of this is, in the end, this is a way of the system to maintain itself and to expand itself. But maybe there is another way of looking at this, which is the fact that maybe the topic of human rights is by degrees. And I also agree with you that Margaret Thatcher was not a big step in the direction of what we want, but nevertheless, women through Margaret Thatcher had the right to do what men do, even if it's still done in the way we don't want it to be done. They have the right to replicate. And what I think here is that maybe the tension is that when a minority wants to be in the map, the minority must first join the rules of the game before these rules can eventually be changed. Anyway, these are just loose thoughts about it.
Yeah, could I come in there as well? Just echoing what Antonio said and replying to Phelim, I guess, as well. There are considerable strengths, I think, in my view, to a functionalist Marxist analysis or functionalist analysis of capitalism. But to quote the Greek Marxist Nikos Palantzis, he one of his last works, he said that capitalism is not the root of all evil, and to give a concrete historical exemplification of that, we can look at China as, if you say, well, China is a communist country, I'm sure most of us would find various transgressions of human rights in both civil and political and social and economic, perhaps, in that country. So if our frame of reference is limited to capitalism and neoliberalism, then what analytical tools do we have when we're discussing non-capitalist systems? So we need those tools. And again, even within capitalism, capitalism not the root of all evil, and I'm not saying anything terribly controversial here, but there are, I would say, other dimensions of power and inequality apart from those based on the capital-labor relation, relatively independent dimensions of gender and patriarchy, of race, of nationalism. I'm thinking of Emanuel Wallerstein's successive analysis of the world system in this respect.
If no one wants, can I say something? I think when we speak of the traditional or well-known analysis of capitalism, we are at the same time aware that we have a lot of new immense problems of inequalities globally also seen. This is the one side, but on the other side, we know that despite all these things like referendums, etc., that there is little thing happening against this, objectively, unfortunately. So the old traditional power forces have disappeared somehow, but the people are on the other side aware of a lot of things. And this brings me to another question, what we have to do maybe in such a group. This may be a little bit utopian, but we have to speak, I think, about immediate things. And one of these immediate things, this is again emotional, I know, is that we have to speak about limitations of certain things. For example, when we see the gap between poor and rich countries in the world, which is steadily opening, in fact, then, and we are seeing, and this is well known, what I say, the minority of a certain group of people who have more money than 50% of the world population, etc., all the things you can read in the web. Then we have, I think, also to speak in these groups the first time maybe about the right of limitations. I will give you one example from Turkey. In Turkey, where we have also a very big gap and also a certain middle class, maybe it's the same in countries like South Africa, George, I don't know, but in Turkey, the majority of the so-called middle class people, this precarium problem, they are more and more coming in a precarious situation, but they have not the will and the organizational tradition to do something against it. And so these groups have to discuss. In Turkey, we have on the one side not enough place for people to pay. The same thing like in Berlin. Remember, the people have no money to live in even modest conditions in houses because the money to pay is so big. So the same in Turkey. So on the one side, the first, how can we say, this market has not been solved. And on the other side, in Turkey, we have a tendency of a certain group of people to buy second houses, and not only second houses, to buy Sommerfrische. What does it mean? They buy houses near the sea, near the ocean, only to get their holidays here. So the first level is not satisfied, and we have the immense, the second level of these people. And in Turkey, we have then the debate, what should we do, certain groups, of course, what should we do immediately to limit these privileges? And I would totally agree. In a country where the first level of flat and commodity of living is not solved, it is again, I will say again, moral. Again, it is not moral to have a summer residence near the sea. We have to speak about these things also. So we have, I think, again, to break taboos, because the traditional, as I said, political parties and movements, etc., are too weak to do this in most of the parts of the world, because there is a dissolution and crash of all these movements that we know, etc. So we have also, I think, to speak about these limitations, which should be happened. There was another man who said, and this is also again provocative, what I say, despite the fact that everyone should live in welfare, of course, but we should speak institutionally and also in these groups about the right of the society, let's say. Now you can ask what is a society, this is the other question. No one should have the right, this should be questions we should put. No one should have the right, for example, to have more than $1 billion money. These are, I think, the problem of human rights debates is that we have these traditional analytical interpretations of capitalism, which I know, most of us know, but we should not hesitate to speak about these taboo, about these limitations. This is one point, which is not done. And especially when it comes to the global dimension, this is a necessity. This is, I think, unacceptable. And the older I get really, the more this is something subjective and maybe not too professional. The more I get angry about these rich people, personally angry, I say, Mehmet, don't do this. Don't make these things too emotional and subjective, but I can't do it. I'm really too aggressive now concerning these people, these rich people. And I think this should be debated, of course, not in a subjective sense, also in our group. And this is the emotional side also of these human rights groups. Okay, like Antonio said, this is also a brainstorming for myself, but I think we should do this also. We should not be, again, limited to these so-called analytical, pure scientific debates about human rights. Especially, again, the legal branch, the legal people should be willing, I think, should be open to see this material side. Otherwise, it's ridiculous. Otherwise, we will continue to have these tons of human rights documents in the European Union, which means nothing. But we have tons of them, tons of these declarations. Okay,
but
this is
what we do in terms of law.
Would say something.
In terms of law, we have in most of the constitutions. Johan, hello.
Yes.
Yes, one. In most of the.
Yeah, hi Peter, I'm here.
Hello.
Hi, hello.
Hi, hi Joe. Hi, Mehmet.
Hi.
Yeah.
In most of the constitutions, we have the obligation of property, social obligation of property. If you have if you say the $1 billion or wherever it is, we have to address this internationally or supranationally, that in one country it is kind of useless because then they leave. I have now another kind of provocation. The well-honored by me, honored colleague Gehring had been writing a beautiful little piece on the tip. And there he was actually pointing out, and this is a very low tip, the money you give to the waiter. Tip.
Oh, tip. All right. Yeah.
The tip. The money you give to the waiter or waitress.
Yeah.
And he was actually working on this tiny thing, on this tiny question, exactly the point of inequality, how you establish inequality. Now, this had been written, I don't know exactly, but 1800 somewhat. And he was elaborating actually how the tip is supporting or establishing inequality. You have to read it. It's even for if you're not, well, especially if you're not in legal issues, it's kind of fun reading, bedside reading, but at the same time making clear it is really on some basic things in everyday's life that you establish and produce, and this is my point, produce inequality. And what you see here on this tiny level of giving a tip or not giving a tip is then, of course, something where you have as well what is with this issue of producing inequality. And there I would not agree. First, they have to accept the rule and then they can step out. I would say don't accept the rules of the game, but propose another game. Because otherwise you are caught, and this is what you said, Mehmet, otherwise you are caught in this framework and you cannot leave the positivist framework. You have social obligation of property. So what's it? We have it. We don't have to fight it. But we have a certain understanding within this understanding of social obligation means, and then you can make billion and more. No problem. If as long as we what you call positive right, and Gehring and Holmes, that's then for the lawyers, had been writing about the struggle for law, and especially this kind of borderline where you can where you fight with legal terms for the extension of an understanding of law.
No contradiction to what I said. You're right.
Peter, can I?
I didn't want to contradict. I didn't want to contradict it.
Yes. George, I think.
Antonio wanted to say something.
Antonio, yes.
I just wanted to share this what Peter just said. I just want to share this idea. Probably you know the fight of the gay and lesbian groups to marry and to constitute a family, while at the same time heterosexual people start to deconstruct the institution of family, of traditional family. The problem is how do you gain the same rights of the majority by proposing a new model without first sharing the structure that the majority already has. Okay, I'm not sure, but I understand that this is interesting in terms of maybe if we want as a group to pinpoint human rights of specific groups, at the same time global rights, and how these two dimensions might coexist or might interact with each other. I think this is an interesting problem. Anyway,
I don't know if I can say something. So interesting, all the observation of the colleagues. Very difficult issues, no? I think not very easy to answer, I think. But according to Antonio's last observation, I think rights is not a fight of rights against rights, no? Against traditional rights, against new issues of rights, new instance of rights. So I think, of course, no, rights is a sort of protection, no, as an issue of protection. So no traditional family, if we can say like this, is not a fight against traditional families, just new different rights that have the necessity of protection. So it's I think it's a different point of view. According to the special and global aspects of human rights, it's of course very, very difficult issues because first we have different evolutions in different cultural, juridical aspects. So Asian rights tradition is totally different with Latin American human rights tradition that is very different from African human rights tradition, legal tradition in general, and then in a specific topic with human rights philosophy and human rights sentiment, we can say, no? So I agree with Mehmet when he say that it's also an aspect of concept. For example, we are seeing that in last years we are seeing a new semantic and semiotic aspect. Let's think about China. China is proposing different science and different words in which we have to reflect on, no? Maybe last night we have a meeting about this, no? About the concept, the difference between the concept of democracy in Western tradition and what about China, no? Maybe the concept of people-centrism, according to the last Xi Jinping thought on the socialism with Chinese characteristics for the new era, no? Between the 14 points of this thought, we have people-centric approach. That seems so different, apparently, but it's a very typical approach in human rights fight. If we think about a United Nations chart or United Nations documents, when we are reading about people-centric approach. So it's quite similar, no? So I think, of course, there are several differences, but there are a lot of bridges in human rights issue that we can build. Of course, capitalism is a problem in this discussion. So I totally agree with Mehmet and Joy. Maybe I can tell you a quote about by a professor from University of Bologna that is working in Argentina in Buenos Aires. She said that capitalism now in human rights approach is a spiritual problem, no? To say with Mehmet that is talking about emotional problem, no? Maybe we can think about a spiritual problem, because when we think about freedom, for example, that's so large, no, so ambiguous term, no? What is freedom? What is the right of freedom? No, we have very, very different answers according to which is the person who is answering us. So my point is, maybe we have to write down a sort of new dictionary of human rights, according and including some thought that were left behind. Let's think about the Human Rights Declaration, no, by United States. In that time, in 1948, the people who write down that declaration, that universal declaration, supposed to be universal, were countries were from countries which were colonizing other countries. So let's think about this, and let's think about a sort of decolonization and deconstruction of these terms according to new instance, especially in human rights. Now I talk about China, but there are several very interesting instances from Latin America, from Africa, from India, from several countries in the Eurasia. So I think we have to open our mind to include to our definition positivist. No, this is the positivism to our definition. New instances, no, with new perspective, with new thought. For us, new, of course, no. There's a traditional in their countries, but I think that the problem is very big, because if we think about gender issues, no, like now we are discussing a little bit more in deep, gender issues at a decrease, a very serious decrease. We are losing fundamental rights that we thought they were already realized. So the point is that the economic crisis with a capitalistic crisis is going to affect also fundamental aspects that we were thinking they were already safe, no? So it is not like this. So it's very dangerous. It's very slippery slope, I can say. So thank you. That was I was sharing with you.
Thank you. And maybe I don't want to be oppressive, but there are still, by the way, hi Theo and Juan again. So we have other contributions or ideas.
Well, I have a confirming sentences from to this last statement. I heard the other day something on the aftermath, or 20 years after 9/11, and somebody saying, actually, I thought this, saying it in this explicit way was funny. Human rights are universal since we colonialized the rest of the world. I thought this was an excellent sentence, really bringing to the point what he probably didn't want to say in this form, but this is exactly this. And perhaps we can, if there's not something immediately to this, no, I'm taking over this again. But there had been this issue coming up again and again in one way or another, the economy and law, and in terms of defining what is legal and in terms of how to implement it. Perhaps this would be a topic then to catch up from here and have another topic the next time.
Can I just add there briefly?
Of course, Joe.
Yeah, thanks, ma'am. Just, and again to repeat, and again in the spirit of provocation, to quote Mehmet, and the spirit of fostering debate, and to repeat myself, I guess certainly from my view, an important function of the group would be to analyze critically. I think analysis is critical as a adverb is redundant, with a polite skepticism, the claims of the whole variety of actors and institutions and systems that we and discourses that we come across, and that includes the claims to progress and critique of decolonizing, anti-colonialist movements. Ireland was the first colony in many readings. So we shouldn't spare a critical gaze or critical. We shouldn't spare any discourses, even those purporting to advance human liberation, of a critical scrutiny.
I want to add something, dear colleagues, concerning the presentation I made, the different actors, what I mentioned, institutional or otherwise. I would say one important aspect of this group could also be to interrogate the, how can we say, on the one side, the immense, let's say, number of institutions and actors dealing with human rights, on the other side. About the documents I already spoke. We have this document production, but on the other side, we have an immense quantity of actors, theoretically dealing with human rights. And my question is, for example, in Turkey, Yasemin knows, we have the migration issue in Turkey has become a sector, an economic sector. For example, we have a lot of projects having to be fulfilled, and the money comes most of the time from European foundations, etc. So the funds, the European funds, and thousands of people, especially young people, are employed in this sector. And it would be worth to analyze if this is also the case for international institutions. I have the feeling this is now mixed together. So people who are speaking in favor of human rights are only there because they have the fear to lose their job in this sector. I think this would be interesting to analyze. I think this is also, maybe this is not a contradiction. Maybe this is the characteristic of all institutions somehow. But if it comes to human rights, this seems to be also, again, a question to be interrogated. For example, in the United Nations, in the European Union, on the national level, we have this quantity of networks and institutions dealing with this. And factually, we are regressing. Factually, we are regressing despite all these people. I have also spoken with Peter and before in this group about these so-called, what I find ridiculous. I mean, this is off the record speech. These ethical commissions in the European Union. We have these ethical commissions, national-wide, also in the universities. So if you make a doctorate thesis, you know, Yasemin, you have to go to this ethical commission. And this ethical commission is a formality, but they're employing certain people. And you have to ask them for permission to make, for example, empirical research on the basis of ethics. This is, for me, it's nonsense, because it's also harming what we call academic freedom, because you have to trust. In academia, you have to trust the people at the same time. You cannot institutionalize everything. And human rights is institutionalizing everything. And these ethical commissions in the European Union, for example, I have listened to the talk shows in Germany. I've spoken with Peter about this. There are these ethical commission participants, and they are really saying nothing. They are speaking about pandemic. If you would put a second-class student to the studio, he or she would speak better than these people. But these people are paid. And for me, it's the other problem, to interrogate the economic side, the economic micro side of human rights, the institutional side. For me, it would be interesting to go into this topic. This was only, again, an idea which I had because the pandemic brought these so-called ethical discussions to the foreground. A lot of these ethical discussions, and most of these discussions are really abstract and are, for me, really meaning nothing than the fact that these people are well paid and have their academic titles. Don't let's say academic titles, these are institutional titles. The only academic title is the PhD. The other things are institutional titles, by the way. So this is something I would also critically interrogate in this group. This would be my interest.
Maybe I'll say something. You see, I think when we talk about human rights, that it's easy to talk about something that is acceptable to wider society, and particularly to the elites in a particular society. Once certain types of ideas and notions about rights become acceptable, it's no longer dangerous to speak up. And I think that that's the reality whenever we talk about Saudi Arabia, for example. It's dangerous to speak up about women's rights in Saudi Arabia. It's not dangerous to speak up about women's rights when it comes to the European Union, for example. But many, many years ago, if we remember the suffragettes, the struggle that they engaged in, it was actually dangerous. I mean, people actually died in that particular campaign for political rights for women. So, I mean, I think when we talk about human rights, that we have to recognize that we're going to get all sorts of people all around the world say they support human rights. I'd say the vast majority of people in the world are going to say they support human rights, but it's a particular version of human rights that they support. And it's taken time for certain types of rights to be acceptable. But once they become acceptable and incorporated into the hierarchical system that we live in globally, then it's safe to talk about those rights. It's not safe to talk about other rights. And I would say that in, for example, the European Union, to talk about needing to challenge capitalism, to overthrow capitalism, to end capitalism, is very controversial, because that links us in with the ideas of Marx, of Lenin, and it also links us into what happened in Eastern Europe. And whatever anyone says about Eastern Europe, one has to realize that the population didn't become socialists and communists. I mean, the systems to me weren't communist and they weren't socialist, but certainly the populations didn't. And you've got populations in Poland and Hungary now that are among the most reactionary in Europe, despite so many years of socialization or supposed socialization. So I suppose my feeling on the whole thing is that we have to recognize that there are different views in the world about what human rights are, which this is where it makes it very difficult to be universalist. But there are very different views, and I've got particular views, and other people have got particular views. But sometimes it's easy to speak up because the views that are being expressed are endorsed and accepted by the elites in society and the powerful in society. And sometimes it's very hard to speak up because you run the risk of being A colleague of mine recently was sacked because he spoke out against Zionism, in a university in Britain, professor. So, you run the risk of being sacked, or you run the risk in some societies of being imprisoned or being assassinated or being whatever. And I think that that's a thing that we need to consider.